Hi everyone, I'm Vikki Hoyle, a Senior Associate in the Regulatory and Compliance team at WalkerMorris. WalkerMorris is a Leeds-based top 100 UK law firm. We're the largest single-site practice outside of London, with 48 partners and over 250 lawyers. We're a full-service commercial law firm, and although we are based solely in Leeds, over 70% of our income is generated from business outside Yorkshire, with our international clients accounting for 20% of that revenue. As I said, I'm a member of the Regulatory and Compliance team. Regulatory means very different things to different people. The cornerstone of our practice is financial services, including payment services. But as the slide shows, we advise on a huge range of topics, including health and safety, anti-money laundering, modern slavery, and my personal expertise, information law and data protection, which is why you get to listen to me tell you all about the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, and why you as payment gateway should care about it. Well, to start with, it's a European data protection law, so it's going to apply in all 28 member states. Brexit, according to, for data protection at least, doesn't actually mean Brexit. So it means Brexit when it means Brexit, and it doesn't mean Brexit when it doesn't mean Brexit. The UK government has confirmed we will be adopting GDPR next year. So we all need to crack on with it. We've got 12 months to go, 368 days if you're setting your watches. It comes into force on the 25th of May next year. The really key point to take away is there are no transitional provisions. It comes in on the 25th of May, and your systems, procedures, policies, operations need to be compliant or you will be in breach. And as you can see at the bottom, the fines go up significantly. Maximum fines will be the greater of 20 million euros or 4% of your global annual turnover, and that could be group turnover. There's still some debate over how that wording works in the regulation. So it puts it up there with competition law and straight into the boardroom. It applies to all personal data. It's not just focused on payment card data. So we're talking names, addresses, any information from which an individual can be identified. Also includes online identifiers like IP addresses and information collected by cookies. So it's very wide-ranging. And there are a lot of changes coming in. This slide shows you the headlines. You'll be very pleased to know we're not going through all of this. We're just going to pick out a couple of the key topics for you as gateways. But it's a big job we've all got to get ready for by next year. So where do we start? Well, it's been good practice for many years to appoint a data protection officer. That becomes mandatory under GDPR if, as part of your core process, your core activities, you monitor regularly and systematically on a large scale individuals. So that includes profiling, behavioural profiling for marketing, fraud prevention. If you're doing that on a large scale, you're probably going to need a mandatory data protection officer. Their role will also change. They cannot be fired for whistleblowing. They need to report to the highest levels of management, and they also need to be an expert in data protection law. You can appoint an existing employee to that role, or you can hire externally. Obviously, there are budgetary implications of that. You either need to account for an additional salary or potentially backfilling activities of a current employee. GDPR really wants everybody to look at what they're doing with data and reassess how they handle it. So it introduces a new concept of privacy by design and default, which is looking at data minimization. What information are you collecting and why? Are you really only collecting the information you need? And it also wants you to look at the basis on which you're processing that data. There are 6 lawful grounds for processing that data, the most common of which people have relied on in the past is consent. Chances are that's not going to be appropriate in all situations going forward. The threshold for a valid consent rises significantly. It has to be specific, informed, unambiguous, and represented by a positive action. So the days of pre-ticked opt-in boxes and almost certainly opt-out boxes are long gone. We need to be able to evidence that the individual really has consented to what you're doing with the data. So for many aspects of the processing, we need to look at alternative bases. So for example, with fraud prevention, it's a legitimate interest of both the gateways and the merchants on whose behalf they act to prevent fraud. So you'd rely on legitimate interests rather than consent. And that whole review then feeds into the processing records that you're now going to have to maintain. The requirements to register annually with your local data protection authority are gone, and you now have to have these written records which you can produce to the data protection authority on demand. And there is quite some, there's a prescriptive piece in the GDPR about what those processing records must contain. And for the first time, we've also got a legal obligation for data breaches to be notified to the relevant data protection authority. That's quite an onerous task. Once an incident has occurred, you've got 72 hours of becoming aware of it to notify the data protection the data protection authority. And again, GDPR prescribes what information has to be prescribed, and it's going to be a large task to pull all that together within 72 hours, which means you're going to need a very robust data breach response plan in place to enable you to meet those requirements. So what does this mean for your IT systems? Well, in addition to the changes we've already talked about, you need to implement appropriate technical and organisational security measures to protect the data you're handling from unauthorised access or disclosure, or from accidental loss, destruction, or damage. Appropriate's not defined within GDPR on the grounds that no one size fits all. It's a risk-based approach depending on the circumstances in which you're carrying out your processing. So it's very similar to PCI DSS, but it doesn't just apply to card data, it's all the personal data you handle, including your employee data, individual data about your business contacts, the whole range. What it really boils down to is you need the right physical and technical security in place, back it up with robust policies and procedures which are actually implemented and embedded within the organisation, and having reliable, well-trained staff who know what they're doing. The other element is that you need to have appropriate technical and organisational security measures to identify immediately when a data breach actually occurs. And the data protection authorities will take into account whether those measures have been implemented when they're considering what, if any, enforcement action to take and whether to impose one of those huge fines. So what about your data centres and your call centres? Well, we've already talked about the fact that Brexit doesn't mean Brexit. So at least up until March 2019, when the UK leaves the EU, data transfers between the EEA and the UK continue as they do now. There will be the same data protection regime and therefore the same level of protection across all those areas. Post March 2019, it's a little unclear what will happen. It's going to, in part, depend on the type of Brexit we have, whether the Commission is feeling particularly friendly towards the UK and will give us an adequacy decision to allow those data transfers to continue. The UK government has said that they do not foresee any significant changes to data protection post-Brexit because they want those data flows to continue unhindered. Slight tweak to that, the Conservative manifesto last week hailed the fact that the UK wants to be the world's internet policeman and referenced a new data protection law, but didn't mention GDPR. Whether that's simply a drafting issue or whether there's a hint that actually the UK is going to take a different data protection route, I'm afraid it's a watch and see. If you're transferring data to the US, if the US organisation you're transferring to is registered on the Privacy Shield list, data transfers can flow freely. If they're not registered, then the US counts as the rest of the world, and you either need, it needs to be one of the jurisdictions for whom an adequacy decision has already been granted: Canada, New Zealand, Argentina, Uruguay, Israel, there were 11 in total, or you need to be putting into place appropriate transfer mechanisms such as the model contract clauses or binding corporate rules, or an alternative transfer mechanism that you assess is adequate, but the risk there is you don't have the guarantee from the Commission that it actually is adequate. Another caveat to all of that, for which I do apologise, the Privacy Shield is due for its first annual joint review in September this year. It's also subject to 2 legal challenges before the European Court. So we don't know where that's going to be by the end of the year. It may or may not still be in place. We are also waiting for a decision from the Irish High Court on whether the model contract clauses should be referred to the European Court. We don't know when that's due, but again, it's a wait and see. international data transfers are going to continue to be exciting news, at least in the DP world, for the foreseeable future. So what about contracts? GDPR includes requirements on what you put in contracts where there's data sharing occurring, whether that's a controller to controller or a controller to processor arrangement, where the supplier is acting as a processor, the requirements are a lot more onerous. You need permission to subcontract, you need to submit to audits, and in the gateway world, probably I think the most onerous is at the end of the contract, you have to be able to delete or return the data that that specific merchant has provided to you. That potentially has huge implications for the way you store and handle data at the moment. All of this means greater service costs for gateways. There's an awful lot of work to be done to bring current systems into compliance with GDPR, particularly potentially on the cybersecurity front. I saw an interesting piece this moment that says, particularly in the wake of the WannaCry issue recently, cybersecurity experts can now command a salary of $850,000. So I'm off to retrain. But it does mean there's a big question over who's going to bear those costs. Smaller gateways certainly aren't going to be absorbed them. Are they going to be able to pass them on to merchants? It's going to be quite a difficult one, I think. And it also means lengthy negotiations over the allocation of risk in contracts, with the increased fines, which are now also payable by processors, and the ability for individuals whose data has been compromised to sue the processors directly. The risk is greater for everybody. Where will that lie within the contracts? So another big piece of work, all existing contracts which will last post the 25th of May need to be reviewed to make sure they're compliant and renegotiated where they're not. And any contracts that are being entered into between now and the 25th of May, which will go beyond the 25th of May, also need to be compliant. For some organisations, that's going to be a huge task involving hundreds, if not thousands, of contracts. The slight caveat to starting now, we're still waiting for guidance from the UK Information Commissioner's Office on contracts and liability and exactly what they expect to see. It was due out at the beginning of this year. I was at a conference recently with a representative from the ICO who said they currently have no timetable for providing that, but they will still expect you to be compliant on the 25th of May. So there's a lot of watch and see, I'm afraid, but 368 days to go, so doing absolutely nothing is not an option, I'm afraid. But now I'm going to hand over to Chris, who's going to find the silver lining for you all.
It may take a little bit of looking. I'll draw a parallel at this point between the PSD2 and GDPR. We ran a series of roadshows with our clients about a year, 18 months ago on PSD2. And it's only really now that clients are beginning to kind of get over the compliance burden piece and begin to think about the opportunities and what they can go and do to take advantage of some of the costs they've had to incur. GDPR is not yet at that stage. We are still, notionally that year and a half ago, where people are aware of it. It's on the edge of their radars. The oh no moment, I think, is slowly dawning on them that I'm actually going to have to do something about it, particularly when it comes to contracts, the relationships they have with the merchants. Those things are going to require changing. But I would urge you all, when you go and talk to your clients in the merchant community, to at least have the opportunities in the back of your mind, even if you're focused on the compliance burden in the short term. I'm just going to talk to three sort of areas grouped into two parts in terms of these opportunities. Pardon me. The first one is around tokenization. Now, this is a slam dunk the payments industry. Because of PCI, we have been here before. The principles of obfuscating and making data unreadable are around and healthy and making money, more importantly. So there are certainly some opportunities there. Second one is security. Again, I'm sure in this audience lots of people get excited by words like point-to-point encryption. But again, it's a healthy part of the payments business, security, and again, it makes money, not just around the principles of access, and we were talking about strong customer authentication earlier, but also in the storage area. Audit and insurance, principles that many organizations have to bear as part of their own organizations. But again, both these principles make money and are used today by acquirers and gateways when they deal with their merchant community. So I'm not talking about like fluffy things that could possibly happen. These are current revenue streams that can be tweaked and adjusted to apply to GDPR in the same way historically they have applied to things like PCI. So try and make a virtue out of PCI. I don't think anybody's ever said that before. But there is an opportunity to reuse the investment that you've made in all of these areas to consider GDPR. Because if this community is slightly fuzzy on what GDPR is and where it's going to go, imagine what the poor merchant community must be feeling. Stephen was talking about Capita. You know, the amount of data that Capita has to handle on behalf of its customers is mind-boggling. Not just in terms of the payment flow, but all of the other information that's gathered about those customers. So I'll just quickly take you through each of them. Tokenization, I'm sure I don't need to tell you very much about. You know, we tokenize PANs today. Is there an opportunity to extend that principle of tokenization to a wider range of payments data, so structured data, the IBAN, other identifiable pieces of information that could be associated with a payment? The good thing about tokenization is that it is at least possible to run it in-house, and or you can use services that are widely available, some from the schemes, some from other bodies. That's a relatively easy thing to do. It's something you do today. Those supplier organizations will be looking to extend the reach of that scope. And in terms of benefits, well, we've said a sort of medium sort of benefit. Customers are going to be looking for it, so probably a fairly good one to pursue. Wider pseudonymization, that's not a word that you want to say after a couple of vodkas, which is the principle of masking customer information, not necessarily tokenizing it, but making it difficult to read. The problem with this is that whilst we talked about payments data and the fact that it's always structured, that's quite easy to tokenize. You know, if I'm looking at an address, or I'm looking at an email, so a physical address or an email or some script about a customer, that's unstructured data. And replacing it with a token doesn't work because the post person has to be able to post that letter. It has to exist, and it's often used as a form of identity checking as well. So this one's actually much more complicated to go after. It doesn't lend itself quite so easily to the technical solutions that we mentioned previously in tokenization. So, this area, whilst the benefit is similar, the effort is much more considerable. It's not necessarily something that you can put a high-powered business analyst on and get them to come up with a technical solution. It requires much more of a consultative interaction with your customer groups. So that's the first layer. The second one is around kind of security. Secure data access. Now, 3D Secure 2.0, strong customer authentication. Yeah, banks have just built all of this, right, or are in the process of building it. Gateways, in particular, typically manage the connectivity into precisely this service. Now, can you reutilize some of the principles that are established for accessing bank data and extend that into the access of other forms of account data? There'd be plenty of appetite, I'm sure, from the providers of these services to extend the reach. It's not just about authenticating a transaction, it's about identifying an individual. So, there are definitely opportunities in that space, but does require some repurposing. It's not necessarily going to be an instant lift and shift. On the secure data storage side, you're doing it already today. The standing data that you collect on customers, can you extend that into standing data that you collect on a wider range of information? Yes, certainly. relatively modest effort to deploy. It can use existing secure storage facilities that you have. Would it deliver benefits? I don't think in and of itself, on its own, it would, but in combination with some of the other elements that we mentioned earlier on, I think it does have value. Now, the next layer, I know plenty of acquirers have relationships with QSAs. Those QSAs are fairly well placed to carry out audits, to understand the impact of GDPR and where things need to change. So there's certainly some opportunities there to extend that relationship into a wider range of services. The last one, I had some conversations recently with some of the people for the Lloyd's insurance market, about how insurance is beginning to adapt to the cyber threat world. And I think at this stage it's fair to say the insurance world hasn't quite caught up with the exact nature of breach risk in GDPR. It's slightly different to other aspects of insurance in the sense that, as Vikki said, I can't prevent a breach from occurring. I can only insure against the potential risk after the breach or after an audit has occurred. If I can build together some of the technical solutions and the audits that we've mentioned previously and say to a regulator, look, I'm doing the very best I can, I strong authenticate customers to make sure that they're the right people coming in, I securely store, I pseudonymize, I tokenize, I carry out annual audits. That's a fairly good way in order to manage your insurance exposure, the risk against which you have to insure. So whilst I don't see it at the moment, one could imagine combinations of the audit, the technical solution, and the insurance coming together to provide quite a nice package. As I said, if you, as potential resellers of insurance products, go to the insurance market today and start talking about this, you will get some blank looks. It is worth persevering. There is money to be made for the people with those blank looks, as well as yourselves. And as I said, that combination of services, I think gateways do have a right to play in this area. I know there are some reputational issues that Phil alluded to earlier on, but generally, if I'm willing to hand over payment details to a third-party organisation, if I'm willing to put a fair amount of trust in that organisation, you certainly have the right to have the conversation about GDPR data. So I think there is definitely an opportunity. I think from a sales point of view, one of the challenges that we find, and I mentioned this right at the beginning, is that the market hasn't quite caught up to some of the risks associated with the products that we're talking about here. So annoyingly, from a sales point of view, there is some education that is required before a customer will buy. That's just a reflection of the stage of the market that we're at. However, that doesn't preclude you from coming up with propositions and offers that could address that need. So we would definitely encourage you to think about some of the silver lining which may emerge from the GDPR compliance effort. And it is worth thinking about coming up with propositions that you can take to your customers, as much to appear a proactive member of the kind of data protection community, and perhaps to soften some of the concerns that may emerge around re-signing contracts or adjusting terms and conditions, or talking about different responsibilities that may exist within the world of GDPR. So I think we're roughly on time. We've got a few minutes for questions, if anybody's got any. Oh, no, I need to pass back to Vikki, sorry.
That's all right.
I've gone ahead of myself, sorry.
It was just sort of a summary of how we get from where we are today to where we need to be in, dare I say again, 368 days. So it's really start with looking at what you're doing now. Full information audit, map out the data, where you're collecting it from, what you're using it for, where you store it, how you secure it, who you share it with, how long you retain it. You're not allowed to keep it for longer than you need it. So you shouldn't have stores and stores of data. But it's looking at all of that and then comparing that to GDPR, doing that gap analysis, and then putting together a GDPR compliance strategy and timetable to prioritise. You know, we've got 368 days. For some people, it's just not realistic to assume that you're going to be ready in 12 months' time, but you need to start. The Irish Data Protection Commissioner has very helpfully said there will be no grace period. They will be knocking on doors on the 26th of May, looking to enforce the full weight of their new fining powers. If you can present them with a compliance strategy and timetable and say, we are working hard, we are on with it, that's going to go a long way to appeasing them. And as the former Information Commissioner said, don't panic, be prepared.